He turned the key from the inside and left me on the porch like a delivery package no one wanted. Those words are not metaphorical. That is the exact sensation that passed through me as I heard the hollow, definitive click of the lock, a sound that pierced deeper than any insult or raised voice ever could, because it was not just the closing of a door, but the closing of a bond, the extinguishing of what I once believed was unshakable between a mother and her son. I stood there for a few seconds, stunned, as the rain began to fall harder, the drops thickening until they were streaming down my hair and trickling into the collar of my sweater, plastering the fabric against my skin so that I could feel every inch of cold dampness seeping into my bones. For a moment, I actually thought it was a mistake, that he would realize, that he would turn the lock back and let me inside, perhaps mutter something about needing space or cooling off, and I would smile weakly, step in, and pretend it was all just a misstep, a bad temper, a misunderstanding. But the longer I stood there, with the rain making rivers on the steps and the night deepening around me, the more I understood that this was not a mistake at all, that this was deliberate. A decision made in the small, tight, calculating heart of a man who was once my little boy, a man who now measured his mother not by love or loyalty, but by inconvenience and liability. I am 78 years old. I live alone now, in a modest rented flat with thin walls and neighbors whose names I do not know, though I hear them through the plaster arguing, laughing, living lives that seem younger, louder, and faster than mine. The kitchen window faces a brick wall, and the bedroom has a single narrow closet where my clothes hang with too much space between them, because there is so little I need these days. I tell myself I am comfortable, that comfort is enough. But comfort is not companionship, and it is not dignity either, though I am learning, belatedly, that dignity sometimes arrives only after the illusions of family are shattered. I did not always live like this. For decades, I poured myself into the life of my son and his family, stitching their needs into every corner of my own existence, paying bills when he stumbled, babysitting children when they had no one else, cooking meals, folding laundry, sending birthday cards, forgiving slights that would have ended friendships, excusing cruelties that I convinced myself were thoughtless rather than intentional. It never occurred to me that one day I would be left outside like some soaked umbrella, forgotten or discarded, while inside the house, warm light glowed across the polished floors I had partly paid for, illuminating furniture I had contributed to, filling the rooms I had once dreamed would hold me too in my old age. I still remember how the rain smelled that night, sharp and metallic, mixed with the faint scent of the lilac bush that clung stubbornly to the side of the porch, a plant I had given them years before, back when I still believed that every gift I brought into their home was a seed of love that would bloom into gratitude and belonging. The petals were falling in clumps under the weight of the storm, and I thought, absurdly, that the bush and I were alike, rooted once in hope, now beaten down, stripped, left to cling without shelter. The street itself was quiet, except for the patter of water against asphalt, and the occasional hiss of tires as cars passed without slowing. No one noticing the old woman standing there, clutching her damp purse as though it contained more than tissues, receipts, and the brittle fragments of her pride. I wish I could say this was the first betrayal, the first act that showed me my place in their world. But that would be a lie. It was the culmination of countless smaller dismissals, The times I was told to wait in the car during gatherings because it might be too much noise for you. The times my suggestions for family vacations were brushed aside with a patronizing smile. The clipped tones in which my son spoke to me. The way his wife's eyes glazed over whenever I began a story from the past, as though I were an outdated commercial airing in the middle of their sleek, modern programming. I endured it all because I believed that mothers endure, that loyalty is measured not by reciprocity, but by perseverance, that one day they would see my sacrifices and thank me, not with grand gestures, but with simple inclusion, a seat at the table, a hand on my arm, a reminder that I belonged. Instead, what I received was a lock turned against me, a door shutting with finality, and the realization that I had been erased from the family portrait long before the rain started falling. Standing there on the porch, soaked through, I thought not just of the moment, but of the years that led to it. I thought of the nights I worked double shifts in the hospital cafeteria to make sure Daniel, my son, my betrayer, could attend the private school he said would change his future. The summers I took no holidays so that he could travel with his friends. The holidays I spent alone after my husband died because Daniel's new in-laws required his presence. The loans I offered without hesitation when he wanted to buy a house bigger than he could afford. The countless meals I cooked, the hours of babysitting I offered, the way I silenced myself whenever I felt unwelcome, telling myself that to complain was to risk distance, and distance was something I could not bear. And yet here I was, distanced to the point of exile, punished not for failing him, but for existing in a form that no longer fit the polished image he and his wife wanted to present to the world. You might think I cried. I did not. The tears had been spent long ago in smaller humiliations, in quiet bathrooms and lonely bedrooms, when I realized I was invisible in gatherings, when birthdays were forgotten, when phone calls were reduced to requests for money or favors. That night on the porch, I felt something heavier than sadness and sharper than grief. I felt the cracking of illusion, the splintering of hope, the cold, clean cut of final understanding. It was not that I was no longer loved. It was that I had not been seen in years, that love had long ago turned to convenience, and convenience had expired. What stood there in the rain was not a mother being punished, but a woman being dismissed. And that realization stiffened my spine, even as the rain soaked through to my bones. I stayed there longer than I should have, partly from disbelief, partly from stubbornness, partly because I had nowhere else to go. The night pressed close, and I thought of the neighbors. Imagined them sipping wine in their living rooms, watching the storm from behind glass. Perhaps noticing me but not daring to intervene. Because to interfere in family matters is to court discomfort. In that silence, I felt not just abandoned by my son, but by the world itself, a woman too old to be rescued, too proud to knock on strangers' doors, too weary to beg for shelter. My handbag, soggy at the edges, contained papers he had asked me to bring, old bank statements, certificates, legal documents. I had carried them carefully, believing his words that he wanted to help me organize my affairs, that he was concerned about my future, that he wanted to ensure everything was in order. Now, as I pressed the bag against me for warmth, I began to suspect another motive, one that I would only confirm later, when the rain had driven me past the threshold of endurance and into the forbidden space of defiance. But that is not yet. That night, in that first hour of exile, I was only a mother on a porch, listening to the rain, remembering lullabies I once sang to a boy who clung to me when storms frightened him. A boy who is now a man capable of locking me outside while thunder rolled. I thought of the irony and almost laughed, though the sound would have been bitter. The truth is, I had been outside for years, outside their plans, outside their hearts, outside the narrative they wanted to tell the world. The lock was not the beginning. It was the final punctuation mark on a sentence I had refused to read. And so, drenched, humiliated, but strangely awake, I stood there and felt the last of my illusions dissolve into the rain. The defining moment, the moment when humiliation became proof, came not in the locking of the door, but in what followed, in the way silence stretched too long and I realized I had been left deliberately rather than accidentally, that my son had not merely acted in haste, but in calculation, and that calculation carried the weight of betrayal heavier than any argument could. Hours later, when the rain had seeped so deep into my clothes that I felt my very skin puckering from dampness, I finally picked up the courage to move, not toward the neighbor's porch, where I might have begged to borrow a phone, not toward the bus stop that stood deserted at the corner, but toward the window that looked into Daniel's study, the one room he always guarded, a room that smelled of expensive paper, polished wood, and the peculiar arrogance of men who like to believe they control the future with the stroke of a pen. The curtain was half drawn, perhaps left carelessly, or perhaps as a sign of the confidence with which he lived his life, believing no one would ever dare intrude upon his private sanctum, least of all his aging mother. I stood outside that window for a long time, my hand hovering above the glass, as if by sheer proximity I could summon the strength to break it, though the very thought felt sacrilegious, for I had been raised to respect walls, to wait for invitations, to never force my way into places where I was not wanted. Yet the rain and the lock and the echo of my son's voice telling me to cool off as though I were some fractious child, not the woman who had carried him in her womb and worked myself ragged for his education, pushed me beyond hesitation. I found a brick by the flower bed, the kind of ordinary brick you keep stacked for repair, and I lifted it with both hands, feeling its weight and the tremor of my own heartbeat as I swung it once, twice, and then let it crash into the pane. The shattering sound was like liberation, sharp, violent, irreversible. The glass splintered into a web of cracks before surrendering completely, and I reached in through the jagged edge, careful not to cut myself, and unlatched the window. Climbing in was neither graceful nor easy. My knees protested, my wet clothes snagged, my breath came in sharp, wheezing bursts. But I managed, pulling myself into the familiar room as though I were breaking into a stranger's life. The carpet was plush beneath my soaked shoes. The desk gleamed with papers neatly stacked. The smell of cologne and wood polish mingled into a kind of smug perfume. For a moment, I simply stood there, dripping onto the carpet, feeling both triumphant and ashamed, as though I had finally crossed a boundary that had been keeping me in place for decades. And though I knew Daniel would rage if he discovered me there, I also knew that rage would be no more cruel than the lock he had already turned against me. I set down my handbag on the desk and touched the papers, curious, half afraid, but unable to resist. There were bills, investment statements, household receipts written in Carla's crisp handwriting, And then, tucked beneath a stack of envelopes, a folder labeled in Daniel's neat block letters, Draft Will. I stared at it, frozen, my breath catching in my throat, as if the words themselves were explosive. He was not old, not even 60. Yet here it was, a plan for what would happen after his death, a plan I expected, in my naivete, to include me, to perhaps leave a line of comfort, a gesture of acknowledgement, a sign that after all the dismissals, there remained some thread of gratitude. My fingers trembled as I opened it, the paper cool and smooth under my damp hands. The words on the page did not soothe me. They burned. Everything, every asset, every investment, every property was neatly divided between Carla and the children. My name was nowhere. The house I had partly paid for, the accounts I had contributed to, even the savings I had once entrusted to him when I thought he was helping me manage my affairs, they were all listed as his, absorbed into his estate, his narrative, his control. Worse still, there was a line that turned my stomach. Funds received from mother considered gifts, non-repayable, fully belonging to estate. Gifts. Non-repayable. As though the sacrifices I had made, the money I had scraped together from decades of labor, were nothing more than offerings tossed at his feet, not investments in the life we shared, not the safety net of a family bond, but mere tokens, stripped of my name and claimed by his. I sat heavily in the leather chair, my clothes clinging uncomfortably, the rainwater dripping onto the folder, and read the lines again and again, each time hoping I had misinterpreted them, each time finding that I had not. My son had not just locked me out of his house. He had locked me out of his future, erased me from his legacy, consigned me to invisibility even in death. The betrayal was not only emotional, it was financial, legal, irrevocable. He had written me out of the very script of his life, and in that instant I understood that everything, the kindnesses, the requests, the sudden urgency about my documents, was a cover for something colder, the desire to control what I had left, to absorb it, to neutralize me as a presence, to turn me from a mother into a forgotten name in a forgotten file. The room felt suffocating. I imagined him sitting there, writing those lines with deliberate calm, perhaps sipping coffee, perhaps smiling faintly, as he calculated how best to present it to his lawyer, never once thinking that I might find it, never once considering that the woman he had depended on for decades might still have the audacity to break her way into the truth. My hands clenched the folder until the edges bent, and though part of me wanted to throw it, to scream, to tear the pages into shreds, I did not. Instead, I slipped the entire draft into my handbag, tucked it between the damp tissues and the folded receipts, and closed the clasp with a snap that sounded to me like a vow. I would not confront him then, not dripping and trembling and humiliated. I would not give him the spectacle of my rage. No, I would keep the knowledge close, carry it out like contraband, and let it remind me of what I must never forget again, that trust, once shattered, is not to be offered freely a second time. When I climbed back out of the window, careful to brush away stray shards of glass, the rain had eased to a drizzle, the storm pulling back into a sullen mist that hung over the streetlights. I walked down the empty road with my handbag pressed tight against my chest, not toward the bus stop or a friend's house, not toward a place of comfort, but toward the dark unknown, carrying with me the evidence of my son's betrayal and the dawning certainty that I could no longer allow myself to be defined by his needs, his image, his carefully constructed will. For the first time in years, I did not feel like someone waiting to be let inside. I felt like someone carrying the key to her own escape. After I left that house, clutching the damp handbag with the stolen draft will inside, I did not feel the triumph I had imagined when I pried the folder from his desk, but instead, a heavier, quieter ache, the kind that settles in the chest like a stone and refuses to move no matter how deeply you breathe. The street stretched ahead of me under a thin drizzle, shining with the reflections of lamps and car lights, yet utterly empty, as though the world had agreed to look away while this private humiliation played itself out. And I walked slowly, not because my legs were weak, but because I could not yet decide where to go, unwilling to admit to myself that I had no destination, that there was not a single door in that neighborhood that would open for me, not a neighbor who would take me in, not even the son I had nurtured who could allow me to cross his threshold with dignity. I wandered, circling blocks that looked too clean, houses too curated, lawns too precisely trimmed, all of them belonging to people who would nod politely at an old woman, but never imagine she had just climbed out of a broken window with her own son's betrayal folded into her purse. When exhaustion forced me to stop, I found a bus shelter, the kind with a narrow bench and smeared glass walls, and I sat down, shivering as the wind slipped through my wet clothes. My hands shook as I opened the handbag to check once more that the folder was there, as if I needed constant reassurance that what I had seen was real, that it was not a fevered invention of a mind too ready to suspect cruelty. The folder was there, the bold block letters spelling out his intention like a cruel headline, and I closed it again quickly, afraid the sight of it would undo what little steadiness remained in me. The buses were infrequent at that hour, and I waited in silence, watching rainwater trace lines down the glass walls, remembering how many times I had waited before in my life. Waited for phone calls that never came. Waited for invitations that were never offered. Waited in hospital corridors while my husband slipped further away. Waited for Daniel to recognize that everything he had achieved was built on my sacrifices. This waiting felt no different, only colder, lonelier, and far more final. Eventually, a bus lumbered into view, its headlights cutting through the mist, and I climbed aboard, fumbling with damp coins, receiving only a distracted glance from the driver. I sat near the back, away from the few other passengers, and stared out the window as the neighborhoods shifted from manicured wealth to neglected blocks where weeds grew through cracked sidewalks and convenience stores glowed dimly in the rain. I did not know where I was going, but I knew I could not return to that house. Not tonight. Not ever in the same way. When the bus stopped near a cluster of aging motels, I pulled the cord and stepped off, feeling the damp pavement rise against my thin soles, and walked toward the one with a flickering sign that promised rooms available. Weekly rates. Cable included. The lobby smelled of bleach and fatigue, the clerk barely lifting his eyes as I handed over crumpled bills and received a key to a room at the end of the second-floor corridor. Inside, the room was small and anonymous, the kind of space designed for people who had no other choices, and I placed my handbag carefully on the chipped desk, sat down on the bed that groaned under my weight, and stared at the beige walls as though they might provide answers. The will draft was still there, silent and damning, and I resisted the urge to open it again, knowing that the words would wound me no less with each repetition. Instead, I thought of Daniel's face, the smooth mask he wore when speaking to colleagues, the polite half-smile he offered to neighbors, the way he looked at me with a mixture of impatience and indulgence, as though I were a child pretending at importance. I thought of the lock turning, the sound of the bolt sliding, and realized that even before the document, the lock itself had been the true declaration of intent. The will was merely proof on paper of what had already been enacted in practice, that I was no longer part of his story, that my presence was tolerated at best, excluded at worst, erased wherever possible. The following days blurred into a strange, muted rhythm. I stayed in that motel room, venturing out only for coffee from the vending machine in the lobby or to buy a sandwich from the gas station across the street. And each night, I returned to the room with its humming air conditioner and scratchy sheets, feeling both invisible and strangely unshackled. Daniel did not call. Carla did not appear. No one came to check if I was safe. No one asked where I had gone after the rain. And though that silence stung, it also clarified what had always been true, that I had been alone for a long time, long before the storm, long before the lock, long before the folder. The realization was bitter but steadying, like medicine that tastes foul but cures something deeper. I began to think more carefully about the papers in my bag. I imagined Daniel returning to his study, discovering the broken glass, the empty space where the folder had been, and realizing that I had taken it. Perhaps he would panic, perhaps he would curse, perhaps he would reassure himself that I was too frail, too timid to use it against him. And in a way, he was right, for I did not yet know what to do, did not yet feel strong enough to march into a lawyer's office and declare my son a thief of not just money, but of legacy. Yet the folder gave me a strange kind of power simply by existing in my possession, a secret he did not expect me to hold, a truth that balanced the scales ever so slightly. I could not undo the years of erasure, but I could prevent him from writing me out completely, at least for now. Still, the isolation gnawed at me. In the evenings, when the rain finally cleared and the motel parking lot glistened under streetlights, I would sit by the window and watch strangers come and go. Families unloading luggage, truckers stretching their legs, young couples arguing softly, and I would think about the life I had built around Daniel, the years I had convinced myself that his success was my success, his home, my home, his children, my continuation. Without that illusion, what remained? A room with beige walls, a handbag with damp edges, and a folder that proved my absence in the only way that mattered to him, on paper. Yet even in that emptiness, a shift was happening, a slow unwinding of the habit of waiting, a recognition that I had spent too long accepting scraps and calling them devotion. One morning, after a restless night, I left the motel and walked aimlessly until I found myself at a small public library tucked between a pawn shop and a laundromat. Inside, the air smelled of dust and ink, and I sat at one of the long tables, pretending to read a discarded newspaper, while in truth I was simply soaking in the silence, the presence of people who did not know me, did not measure me against their expectations. It was there that I realized how much of my life had been spent in quiet corners, waiting for acknowledgement that never came, and how little time I might have left to demand more. The will draft in my bag was not just a legal document. It was a mirror, reflecting back to me the truth I had avoided. I was expendable to my own son. That knowledge deepened the sense of erasure over the following days. Each time I thought of calling him, of demanding explanation, of asking why he had written me out, I imagined the likely answers: evasions, justifications, the tired rhetoric of, "You wouldn't understand." I knew those words too well, had lived beneath their weight for years, and I no longer wished to hear them. The silence between us stretched, thickened, became its own message, and though it cut, it also freed me from expectation. I stopped waiting for the phone to ring. I stopped expecting a knock on the motel door. I began, tentatively, to imagine a life where my worth was not tethered to whether or not Daniel remembered me. A life where I might decide my own narrative rather than appear only as a shadow in his. That was the first escalation, not dramatic in appearance, no shouting, no confrontation, but the slow, heavy awareness that deepened with each passing day. The realization that the door would not reopen, that the lock had not been a moment of anger, but the sealing of a choice, that the will was not a draft, but a prophecy. I had been erased from his world, and now I must decide whether I would allow myself to fade quietly, or whether I would seize what dignity remained and step fully into a different story. The turning point did not arrive with thunder or with shouting, but with something quieter, something almost domestic in its ordinariness, the kind of moment that passes unnoticed by the world, yet changes the life of the one who finally sees herself differently. After nearly a week at the motel, living in that beige room with its humming air conditioner and its indifferent bedspread, I woke one morning to find the rain had stopped, the air clear and sharp, the kind of morning that seems to insist on movement. I dressed slowly, my clothes still slightly musty from dampness that never seemed to fully leave, and slipped the folder with the will draft back into my handbag. I carried it everywhere now, not because I needed to reread it, but because it felt like a talisman, a heavy reminder of betrayal that also, strangely, steadied me, as if keeping it close was both a burden and a shield. I walked out into the day with no plan, just the impulse to move my body forward, to not sit another hour staring at the motel's stained ceiling tiles. The streets near the bus stop were lined with small shops, most of them weary, their paint peeling, their windows cluttered with flyers advertising everything from payday loans to used furniture. Yet in the middle of this tired block stood a small cafe with a hand-painted sign that simply read, "Open." The smell of coffee drifted out when I pushed the door open, and I stepped inside not for caffeine, but for something else, though I could not yet name it. The place was quiet, a handful of tables, a counter with mismatched stools, the kind of establishment that survives not on image but on habit, kept alive by regulars who return every morning out of routine. I ordered a coffee, paid with cash, and sat by the window. As I sipped, I felt something shift, something subtle but undeniable. For years I had been served in houses where I was invisible, meals prepared in kitchens where my presence was tolerated but not welcomed. Here, in this modest cafe, the young woman behind the counter had looked me in the eye, had asked me what I wanted as though my choice mattered, had poured my coffee with no hesitation. And in that small act, I realized how starved I had become for acknowledgement. I sat there for hours, watching people come and go, listening to the clink of cups, the murmur of conversation, and with each passing minute, I began to imagine myself not as a cast-off waiting for her son's approval, but as a woman who could belong to the world again on her own terms. That imagination grew bolder when I noticed a handwritten note taped near the register. Help wanted. Morning shift. Inquire within. For a long time I stared at it, my mind reflexively dismissing the idea, telling me I was too old, too tired, too out of practice. But another part of me, the part that had hefted a brick and broken glass when the door would not open, whispered that perhaps I could. I did not apply that day. I simply folded the idea into myself like a secret seed. When I returned to the motel, the beige walls no longer felt like imprisonment, but like a waiting room for something I had not yet named. I opened my handbag and looked at the folder once more, and instead of pain alone, I felt a strange current of strength. If Daniel had erased me, if he had written me out, then perhaps it was time I wrote myself in somewhere else. The will was his attempt to fix the story permanently, but stories can be revised, lives can be reimagined, and though I was 78, I was not yet finished. That night, I lay awake on the scratchy bedspread and thought not of Daniel's lock, not of Carla's smirk, but of the possibility of living without their shadows at all. The next morning, I rose early, walked back to the cafe, and when the young woman behind the counter greeted me, I asked, my voice steady, though my heart raced, "Are you still looking for help?" She blinked, surprised, and then nodded. "Yes, mornings mostly." "Do you have experience?" I smiled faintly, thinking of decades spent raising children, cooking meals, balancing budgets, surviving tempests. "More than you'd think," I said. She handed me a short form and told me to come the next morning for a trial shift. I left the cafe not with a job yet, but with something more valuable, the beginning of a future not defined by exclusion. Walking back, I passed a row of bulletin boards stapled with notices. Rooms for rent, lessons offered, services advertised. One caught my eye. Room available. Quiet tenant only. Weekly rent. Call Joyce. The handwriting was blocky, impatient. The kind of hand that suggested someone who would not waste time with nonsense. I copied down the number on a scrap of paper and tucked it into my pocket. I did not call immediately, but the act of writing it down was itself a shift. For so long I had lived at the mercy of invitations, waiting to be asked, waiting to be included. Now I was beginning slowly to invite myself. Back in the motel room, I sat at the chipped desk, pulled a blank page from the notepad by the phone, and began to write. Not a letter to Daniel, not an explanation to Carla, but a list of what I wanted. It was awkward at first, the pen heavy in my hand, the words reluctant, but eventually they came. A room of my own where I paid the rent myself. A routine that was mine. Work that gave me not wealth, but purpose. A friend who saw me as more than an obligation and, most of all, a life where I was not erased. When I looked at the list, I realized it was modest, far less than what I had given others, yet it felt daring, because it was for me and me alone. That was the midpoint, the beginning of a shift I could not yet fully articulate, but could feel pulsing beneath the surface of my days. The lock and the rain had broken something inside me, but in the breaking, there was also release. I was no longer waiting for Daniel to unlock the door. I had broken my own way inside, taken what I needed, and now I was stepping out, not as a cast-off, not as a shadow, but as a woman who still had choices. And choices, however small, are the first taste of freedom. The days that followed my small acts of defiance, the job inquiry, the copied phone number for the room, the quiet list of what I wanted, should have been the beginning of calm, the settling of a new rhythm, and in many ways they were. But calm has a way of attracting storms, and just as I began to steady myself, the past returned in forms I had not anticipated, pressing against the fragile walls I was trying to build around a new life. The cafe gave me purpose. The first trial shift exhausting, yet strangely exhilarating. My body aching afterward in ways that reminded me I was still capable, still needed, still able to contribute something more than reluctant presence at a family gathering. Joyce, the woman renting the room, turned out to be brusque but fair, her house cluttered but alive, and moving into that upstairs space felt like stepping into a chapter where I was not a burden, but a tenant, not an afterthought, but a participant. The will draft remained hidden in my handbag at first, then in the drawer beside my narrow bed, and every time I touched the folder, I felt again both the wound of betrayal and the pulse of determination. For the first time in years, I was building something for myself. But nothing stays undisturbed. The silence from Daniel stretched on, and then, like a fissure suddenly opening in a wall, it was broken by a letter. Not from him, but from my grandson, Kieran. The envelope arrived at Joyce's house one afternoon, addressed in a hand that was still slightly awkward, still searching for its shape, and the sight of it made my breath catch. Inside, a few short lines. He had noticed my absence, had been asking where I was, had grown suspicious when his parents brushed off his questions. He wrote that he missed me, that he worried, that he hoped I was safe. The letter was short, unpolished, but the sincerity of it struck me harder than any polished apology ever could. I sat on the narrow bed and read it again and again, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes, not because I was sad, but because I had not realized how desperately I needed to be remembered, how hungry I was for one genuine voice reaching across the silence to say, "You matter still." That letter should have been enough to sustain me, and for a time it was. But soon afterward, the second storm came. Not the rain of weather, but the rain of intrusion. Carla appeared at the cafe one morning. I had just begun to find a rhythm behind the counter, pouring coffee for a pair of nurses who spoke in tired murmurs, when the door chimed and she walked in, her coat immaculate, her posture stiff, her eyes scanning the room like a queen entering foreign territory. My heart lurched, but I kept my face still, continued wiping the counter as though she were any other customer. She hesitated, glanced around at the mismatched tables and the cracked stools, as though the very place offended her, and then her eyes settled on me. For a moment, she did not speak. Then, softly but urgently, she asked if we could talk in private. I gestured toward the back booth, my hands steady, though inside me a storm was rising. She slid into the booth and lowered her voice, telling me that Daniel was worried, that the children were confused, that my disappearance had caused distress. Her words were rehearsed, smooth, like lines from a script she had prepared. I listened, silent, letting her fill the space with her performance of concern. And then she reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. She pushed it across the table, saying it was a note from Kieran, that he wanted me to have it. I took it, not because I trusted her, but because I trusted him. Then, almost as an afterthought, she said that Daniel had not meant to hurt me, that things had simply escalated, that perhaps I had misunderstood, that maybe it would be better if I came home and allowed them to explain. I stared at her manicured hands, at the way they clutched the coffee cup without drinking, and I said nothing because I realized no explanation would undo the lock I had heard turn behind me. No soft words could erase the ink on that will draft. Silence can be sharper than speech, and when I remained silent long enough, she faltered, her confidence slipping, her cheeks tightening. Finally, she stood, muttered something about hoping I would call, and left, her perfume lingering in the booth long after she had gone. That visit rattled me, not because I believed her, but because I understood what it meant. They knew I was gone. They knew I had chosen absence. And now they were not pleading, but probing, testing to see if they could still reel me back. A few days later, the testing escalated again. Joyce slid the morning newspaper across the kitchen table one evening, her eyes sharp but unspeaking. And there on the front of the community section was my photograph. An old image from some family gathering, me holding a pie dish, smiling faintly. The headline read, "Family Seeks Missing Matriarch." The article quoted Daniel and Carla, their voices dripping with fabricated concern, describing me as vulnerable, confused, perhaps in need of help. They painted me as fragile, as lost, as someone who had wandered rather than someone who had chosen. Reading those words, I felt my throat tighten, not with sadness, but with fury. To the world they pretended to search for me, while to my face they had locked me out and written me away. The performance was obscene, and I laughed bitterly at the absurdity of it, the audacity of people who erase you in private, but weep for you in public. Still, this too was not the end. A week later, a man in a neat suit appeared outside the cafe just as my shift ended. He introduced himself as an attorney, hired by Daniel and Carla to ensure my well-being and discuss my situation. His words were careful, his tone patronizing, and when he mentioned assets, I understood immediately what this was. Not concern, but control. Not care, but calculation. I folded my apron carefully, placed it on the counter, and told him with a voice as steady as stone that I was not a pet they had forgotten to collect, that my well-being was mine to define, and that any further attempts to press me would be treated as harassment. His eyes flickered, surprised, perhaps not expecting the old woman before him to know the word harassment or to wield it like a blade. I walked past him without looking back, the cold air outside bracing my lungs like victory. But victory was never simple. That evening, as I sat in my room at Joyce's house with the folder spread out before me, I felt the weight of the escalation pressing in. The letter from Kieran, Carla's visit, the article, the lawyer. They were not accidents, they were strategies. I was not simply being sought, I was being pressured, manipulated, pushed toward submission. My possession of the will draft made me dangerous in ways they could not name, but surely suspected. And the realization filled me with both dread and determination. If I faltered now, if I gave in, I would be absorbed back into their narrative, rewritten as the fragile matriarch who needed their guidance, erased once more, this time permanently. I held the folder, tracing my name where it should have been but was not, and I thought of the night on the porch, the rain in my hair, the sound of the lock. That moment had been the final cut. But these new intrusions were the tests, the pressure to see if I would retreat, if I would apologize, if I would accept invisibility in exchange for the false safety of their house. I knew then that this was the true escalation, not the cruelty of one night, but the ongoing attempt to undo my awakening, to drag me back into silence. And I knew, too, that I could not allow it. The days grew heavier, the tension thicker. I could feel their eyes on me even when they were not there, could sense their reach extending through articles, through lawyers, through whispered visits. Yet alongside the fear was a clarity I had never possessed before. For the first time in my life, I was no longer waiting for their approval. For the first time, I had evidence, physical, undeniable, of the truth I had always suspected. And for the first time, I was ready not only to defend myself, but to step beyond the narrative they had written for me. The escalation was real, pressing, suffocating, but it was also sharpening me, forging me into someone who could no longer be dismissed. And so each night as I folded the folder back into the drawer, I whispered to myself a vow. They may come with letters, with articles, with lawyers, with guilt, but I would not return. The lock had been turned, the rain had fallen, the will had spoken, and now it was my turn to write. There comes a point when silence is no longer strength, but surrender, when waiting ceases to be patience and becomes permission. And I realized, with the weight of certainty, that if I allowed their letters, their lawyers, their false performances of concern to pass unchallenged, then I would be complicit in my own erasure, a participant in the narrative that painted me as fragile, confused, and disposable. The lock and the rain had awakened me. The folder in my drawer had armed me, and the small steps I had taken into a new life had steadied me. But none of it would mean anything if I did not act, if I did not cut the tether completely. I had lived too many years in half measures, swallowing insults, ignoring dismissals, enduring coldness in the hope of warmer tomorrows that never arrived. I could not live the rest of my days half free, half erased. So I sat at Joyce's kitchen table one night, the light dim, the cat circling my ankles, and I spread out paper and pen, knowing that words written deliberately can be sharper than glass, knowing that what I wrote now would be final, irreversible, not a cry for attention, but a declaration of independence. The first letter was to the lawyer who had appeared at the cafe with his smooth tone and careful words. I wrote in neat, unshaking script that I was of sound mind, that I was living in safety of my own choosing, that any further attempts to contact me under the guise of concern would be treated as harassment, and that I had retained counsel of my own. It was not entirely true. I had not yet retained anyone, but the threat was enough, and the certainty in my voice was real. I signed it with my full name, Martha Harlow, pressing the pen into the paper so deeply that the indentation showed on the sheet beneath. This was not a plea. It was not even an argument. It was a wall, one I built not to keep myself locked out, but to keep them from breaking back in. The second letter was shorter, almost cruel in its brevity, though cruelty was not my aim. It was addressed to Carla. I told her 3 things: that I knew what had been done, that I knew what had been left unsaid, and that I was neither angry nor returning. I told her to take care of her own life, because I had finally begun mine. That was all. No explanations, no apologies, no accusations. Just the truth, stripped of the embroidery with which I had softened every blow my whole life. For decades, I had written long letters of justification, pouring out paragraphs of defense and tenderness, trying to be understood. This time I wrote with the authority of someone who no longer required understanding, only distance. When I sealed both envelopes and set them aside, I felt the strange calm that comes not after winning, but after deciding. The stillness of a battle already ended in the heart before it is ever fought in the world. I mailed them the next morning, walking to the post office in my navy coat, the one I had bought with my first paycheck at the cafe, the coat that felt like proof of my new life. Dropping those envelopes into the metal slot was like exhaling after holding my breath for years. And when the sound of the metal flap closing rang in my ears, I smiled. A small, private smile that no one else saw. But the climax was not in the mailing alone. It was in what came afterward, in the decision to protect not just my silence but my substance. I took the folder from the drawer, the draft will that had once felt like a wound and now felt like a weapon, and I carried it with me to a lawyer whose office sat above a bakery, a modest man with weary eyes who looked at me not as a confused old woman, but as a client. I laid the folder before him and told him the truth, that my son had locked me out, that I had found this draft, that my name had been erased, though my money had built the very walls of his house. He read silently, nodding, his expression hardening as he turned the pages. And then he told me in steady tones that what I had described was not only cruel, but contestable, that my contributions could not be so easily dismissed, that I had rights my son perhaps did not expect me to claim. I left his office lighter, not because justice had been served, but because I had finally stepped into the realm of claiming instead of giving, defending instead of enduring. That night, Joyce poured us both glasses of wine from a box and asked why I seemed different. I told her simply, I wrote the last letter I needed to write. She did not press, only raised her glass in a silent toast. And in that gesture, I felt the acknowledgement I had craved for years, the quiet recognition that I had acted not as a victim, but as a woman who had finally stopped asking for permission. The climax was not loud. There were no slammed doors, no shouted arguments, no scenes fit for the theater. It was quieter, more deliberate, more enduring. It was the moment I refused to be rewritten. It was the moment I claimed the dignity that had always been mine, but that I had surrendered piece by piece until there was almost nothing left. Now, with pen and paper, with envelope and postage, with signature and seal, I had reclaimed it. And once reclaimed, it could not be given away again. Now the days passed differently, not with the heaviness of waiting, but with the lightness of choosing. And though my body still carries its years, though my hands are marked with veins and my back sometimes aches after hours at the cafe, I no longer feel like a burden moving through borrowed spaces. I feel like a woman occupying her own life. The small upstairs room at Joyce's house has become more than shelter. It has become a home, not grand, not adorned with the trappings of wealth, but honest, filled with the sound of her radio humming in the evenings, the smell of her stew drifting through the hallway, and the quiet satisfaction of paying my rent each week with money I earned myself. There is pride in that exchange, a pride I had almost forgotten existed, the pride of being self-sufficient, of not waiting for scraps or tolerating condescension. I wake in the mornings with purpose, walk to the cafe in my navy coat, greet the regulars, pour their coffee, listen to their stories, and each smile I receive in return feels like a kind of currency more valuable than anything Daniel could ever leave me in a will. The folder, once a source of torment, rests now in a locked drawer, not because I intend to forget it, but because I have transformed it into proof rather than poison. It is there if ever needed, a reminder that betrayal can be documented, that my erasure was not imagined, but it no longer defines my waking hours. I have spoken with the lawyer twice more, set in motion the quiet wheels of legal clarity, not out of vengeance, but out of duty to myself, because I will not allow my years of labor to be stolen, or my name to be erased without resistance. Yet I no longer linger over those papers at night. I no longer trace the cruel lines with trembling fingers. They are evidence now, not chains. Sometimes I think of Daniel, though less often than I once did. I imagine him in that house, moving through polished rooms, his life carefully arranged, his words rehearsed for neighbors and colleagues, his narrative intact, except for the missing piece of me, a piece he may pretend is gone, but that I carry with me still. I wonder if he feels the absence, if the silence I have created unsettles him, if Carla notices the space I no longer fill with reluctant compliance. Perhaps they do. Perhaps they do not. It no longer matters. My life has shifted away from the axis of their approval, and that is the greatest freedom I have ever known. I think instead of Kieran, my grandson, whose letter reminded me that truth cannot be fully buried, that even within a house where silence is enforced, a young voice can rise to ask questions. I keep his letter folded inside a book on my nightstand, and sometimes, when doubt creeps in, I unfold it and read his words again, shaky and imperfect, but filled with care. He reminded me that invisibility is not total, that even when adults conspire to erase, a child can still see. For his sake, I remain visible, living a life that may one day show him that silence is not the only choice, that dignity is not something others grant you, but something you claim when all else is stripped away. There is peace now in my routines, in the quiet conversations with Joyce over tea, in the warmth of the cafe when the morning sun filters through the windows, in the satisfaction of writing letters to myself in the evenings. Not apologies or explanations, but simple reflections, fragments of truth that belong only to me. I no longer ask to be included in stories that exclude me. I no longer beg for space at tables where my chair has been taken away. Instead, I build small tables of my own, modest but solid, and around them I gather the pieces of a life that is mine. If there is one thing I would tell another woman standing where I once stood, it is this: if your child locks you out, do not waste your years in the rain waiting for the door to reopen. Do not stand shivering on the porch of someone else's approval. Break the window if you must. Step back inside, take what is hidden, and then leave again, not as an exile, but as someone who has chosen her own road. The rain will pass, the cold will lift, and on the other side you may find, as I have, that dignity grows stronger in solitude than in any house where you are unwelcome. I am 78 years old, and I am not waiting anymore. I am living. I am writing. I am working. And though the world may still see me as old, fragile, invisible, I know better. I am not the erased name on a draft of a will. I am not the silence behind a locked door. I am the woman who broke the glass, who found the truth, who walked away and built a life where her name, her story, her dignity are no longer negotiable. And that, at last, is enough.